The stone of the Colosseum, still slick with yesterday's blood, caught the dawn's first light. Here, death was not an end, it was the main act. The colossal arches of the arena caught the first pale light. Yet, the stone still bore the crimson stains of yesterday, a shadow that lingered. Beneath the soaring stands, voices hawked olives and watered wine, a macabre prelude for a crowd yet to settle into their seats. Beyond the iron gates, the air thrummed with raw fear and coiled fury. Half-starved lions, their ribs stark beneath patchy fur, paced relentlessly. Elephants stamped, a primal rage vibrating through the earth. Panthers raked their claws against unforgiving bars. From the tunnels below, the sharp clang of steel echoed, not the dull rhythm of practice, but the testing ring of killing blades. Above it all, a low hum began to swell, escalating into a thunderous roar. Tens of thousands of Romans poured in, their hunger palpable. They craved the spectacle their empire had perfected beyond all others: death, meticulously choreographed as entertainment. The Roman arena was far more than a mere sport. It stood as a grim laboratory, an unyielding stage for the exploration of cruelty. Emperors commanded vast floods to transform the sand into temporary lakes for naval battles. Wild animals were systematically starved to sharpen the edge of suspense. Prisoners were forced into grotesque reenactments of ancient myths, tales that invariably ended with very real, silent corpses. None of this was born of chance. It was policy, deeply woven into the very fabric of Rome's machinery of control. The cheers erupting from the stands were not harmless bursts of enthusiasm. They were declarations of loyalty, shouted loud enough to resonate through the corridors of history. Today, we step directly into that enduring shadow. We will uncover the most brutal, the most inhumane arena acts that pushed boundaries, even for Rome. From blood-soaked funeral rites to executions meticulously disguised as high theater, we will unveil how an empire forged its glory by expertly transforming suffering into thunderous applause. The inaugural gladiatorial combat in Rome unfolded without the usual fanfare of golden trumpets or emperors adorned in royal purple. Its genesis was far more somber: a funeral. In 264 BC, the sons of Decimus Junius Brutus Sceva chose a starkly different way to honor their departed father. Instead of erecting grand statues or offering solemn prayers, they chose blood. They armed 3 pairs of slaves, compelling them to fight to the death within the Forum Boarium, a bustling cattle market thick with the mingled stench of dung and wood smoke. This was not yet entertainment in the sense we understand it. It was a sacred duty, a munus, an obligation deeply owed to the restless spirits of the dead. Its roots stretched back far beyond Rome itself. In Campania, warriors were ritually slain at gravesides believed to appease troubled spirits. Over time, this grim practice shifted. Random killings evolved into orchestrated combat. The dead no longer demanded arbitrary victims, but rather a contest of skill and life between chosen men. The Samnites, once Rome's fiercest adversaries, often hosted such contests, and Roman elites, ever keen to assert their status, eagerly embraced the custom. Burying a man with a hoard of treasures certainly showcased wealth. But burying him with a blood-drenched spectacle, a public display of raw, fatal power, proved something far more profound. Yet, funerals were merely the genesis. By the 3rd century BC, Rome's astute leaders began to grasp that these brutal fights could achieve far more than simply honoring ancestors. They could stabilize politics. Religious festivals, once reverent offerings to Jupiter, gradually began to feature gladiators. The Senate, ever masters of rhetoric, framed this as piety. But the discerning crowd understood the true motive: state-sponsored violence, meticulously designed to keep the populace loyal and quiescent. Even the very armor worn by early fighters whispered stories of conquest. Combatants would don the distinctive forms of Rome's defeated enemies: the heavy shield of the Samnite, the curved blade of the Thracian, the broadsword of the Gaul. Watching them bleed was akin to watching Rome's indelible victories replayed, slash after agonizing slash. Death itself became propaganda, and as blood continued to flow, the venues themselves swelled. Temporary wooden stands gave way to permanent, colossal amphitheaters, veritable temples dedicated to violence, where thousands gathered in fervent anticipation. The games no longer belonged to grieving families; they belonged unequivocally to the state. Every drop of blood spilled carried the same chilling message: Rome commanded men, armies, even the very act of death itself. No one then could have truly foreseen the depths to which this would descend. What began as a solemn ritual sacrifice gradually morphed into grand bloody theater. Duty became a ravenous obsession. Rome had unearthed a formidable new weapon: power, not just over the living, but over the very meaning of dying. And once this door was flung open, it was never truly closed. The deafening roar of the crowd was not exclusively reserved for men. Sometimes it thundered for magnificent beasts, hauled from the farthest, most exotic edges of the known world. Mighty lions from the sun-scorched lands of North Africa, elusive leopards from the rugged Caucasus Mountains, formidable crocodiles from the ancient Nile, even towering giraffes, laboriously dragged across vast, unforgiving deserts. They were not paraded as natural wonders to be admired. Instead, they were condemned as mere prey, destined for a carnival of orchestrated slaughter. Romans called these brutal spectacles venetanes, hunts. They were never about survival, but about absolute domination. They served as irrefutable proof that the empire could ensnare the wildest creatures and systematically destroy them for the sheer pleasure of it. Julius Caesar himself set this brutal tone in 46 BC. He paraded a giraffe, the very first ever seen in Europe. Romans, lacking a name for such an outlandish creature, dubbed it a camelopard, imagining it half camel, half leopard. Yet its identity was irrelevant. The majestic animal was not admired; it was brutally thrown into the sand to be torn apart. The message delivered was chillingly unmistakable. If Rome could seize the strangest, most magnificent beasts alive, then it could conquer absolutely anything. The slaughter only intensified. When the colossal Colosseum finally opened its gates in 80 AD, Emperor Titus reportedly presided over the deaths of more than 9,000 animals in a single, prolonged festival. Archaeologists have since unearthed bones bearing distinct marks of deliberate starvation, incontrovertible evidence that lions and bears were systematically weakened beforehand, designed to ensure a swift, bloody kill. Even elephants, once the terrifying bane of Roman legions under Hannibal, were herded into the arena and butchered to the roar of the cheering multitudes. Behind the scenes, the sheer logistics of this cruelty were a spectacle in themselves. Exotic creatures had to be expertly trapped, then arduously hauled across scorching deserts, kept barely alive just long enough to meet their preordained doom. Caravans, laden with chains and cages, snaked through blistering sands, delivering their living victims to a city that demanded fresh blood with every sunrise. Fleets ferried them down the Nile. Handlers, risking their very lives, delivered these living trophies to Rome. To glimpse a panther in the wild was dangerous enough. To witness one explode from a cage before 50,000 screaming spectators, a raw embodiment of untamed power, was something else entirely. Every single creature became a living souvenir of conquest,
incontrovertible proof that the empire's insatiable reach knew absolutely no limits. Some emperors transformed these hunts into their own personal stages. Commodus, perhaps Rome's most flamboyant and self-absorbed showman, strode into the arena dressed as the legendary Hercules. He personally slaughtered hundreds of animals. He yearned to appear as a god among beasts, yet everyone could perceive the stark truth: a deeply fragile ego armed with a bow and a club. The hunts were, more often than not, elaborately rigged. Animals were chained, maimed, or deliberately half-starved, all to ensure the emperor could bask in a guaranteed, effortless victory. And the people? They cheered, not necessarily out of admiration, but because when the emperor hunted, silence could prove fatal. Yet, behind the thunderous cheers, a quieter, profound tragedy was unfolding.
Ancient writers like Pliny the Elder warned eloquently of how entire rare species vanished from their homelands after decades of relentless Roman slaughter. Lions, leopards, and even mighty elephants were systematically pushed towards extinction, all to feed the empire's insatiable appetite for spectacle. The Colosseum was not merely a theater of death. It was an ecological wrecking ball, devastating the natural world. But for Rome, extinction held no weight. What truly mattered was the powerful illusion that nature itself could be captured, starved, and ultimately destroyed for amusement. Every single carcass on the sand served as another brutal brick in the unyielding wall of imperial control. When you envision a gladiator, you might picture two evenly matched warriors locked in noble, fair combat. The harsh reality was far more twisted. Rome thrived on imbalance, on contests deliberately engineered for maximum cruelty. They crafted bizarre weapons, imposed absurd, illogical rules, and staged fights designed so no one could truly win, not in any honorable sense. Some victims were not fighters at all. Prisoners and condemned criminals were unceremoniously shoved into the arena, dressed as grotesque clowns, handed flimsy wooden swords, and sent to their certain deaths against seasoned, hardened killers. The crowd jeered, roaring with laughter as the doomed flailed uselessly and fell. This was public execution, meticulously disguised as a thrilling sport. Even the weapons themselves took on distinct personalities. The retiarius fought with a fisherman's net and a trident, squaring off against the secutor, whose smooth, rounded helmet was specifically designed to deflect the net. It was never about pure skill. It was about raw suspense, a living riddle of whether the net would ensnare or the sword would finally break through. Romans devoured that tension, even when the match felt as meticulously scripted as a stage play. The numbers grew ever more obscene. Sometimes a single gladiator was thrown against several foes. On other days, entire units clashed like miniature armies, transforming the arena floor into a viscous swamp of blood, splintered shields, and mangled corpses. And when novelty began to wane, they reached even further. Female gladiators, gladiatrices, stepped onto the sand in the 1st century AD. Writers like Juvenal mocked them, yet historical records irrefutably prove they fought for real, against dwarfs, against wild beasts, even against each other. Their presence blurred traditional gender lines, but it simultaneously reinforced a darker, more profound truth. No one, neither man nor woman, was beyond Rome's insatiable hunger for spectacle. Even the helmets were designed as instruments of torment. Some narrowed vision or muffled sound, forcing fighters to stumble half-blind while the audience roared with cruel laughter. Others were so heavy that merely raising one's head became a grueling contest in itself.
Armor was not always protection. Sometimes it was an explicit form of punishment. And then came the propaganda plays. Gladiators dressed as barbarians, forced to mimic Rome's defeated enemies. Their inevitable, brutal loss served as a stark, chilling reminder to everyone present that the empire always, unequivocally, prevailed. Every mismatch, every exotic twist, every gender-bending stunt was meticulously designed to keep the crowds shocked, obedient, and endlessly begging for more. The Colosseum never settled for mere repetition. It constantly invented new cruelties, perpetually hunting for the next, most extreme thrill. By midday, once the morning's gory jewels had soaked the sand and the crowd's initial fervor began to wane, the arena shifted gears dramatically. Combat gave way to a chilling form of theater, with death taking center stage as its undeniable star. Romans termed this damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. For those condemned, it was no trial, it was a script, brutally forced upon them that they had absolutely no power to refuse. Criminals, deserters, rebellious slaves, and prisoners of war all became unwilling actors in an execution meticulously disguised as myth. Each victim's punishment was crafted to mirror their alleged crime. Thieves were torn apart by wolves. Arsonists were burned alive. Traitors were thrown to hungry lions. Every scene was a morality play, written not with ink, but with very real, flowing blood. The sheer scale of this horror could stagger belief. During Emperor Trajan's celebrations following his triumphant Dacian victory, thousands of captives were relentlessly slaughtered over 103 brutal days. This was no random carnage. It was organized, paced with the grim precision of acts in a macabre drama. Every death was carefully crafted to keep the audience perpetually on edge, anticipating the next horror. Animals, of course, were the nightmare's true stars. Lions were deliberately starved to a frenzied hunger before their release. Bears, chained in pits, were goaded into sudden, explosive fury. Even highly prized leopards were unleashed upon trembling, defenseless victims. The inherent uncertainty, would the beast strike fast or would it toy with its prey, kept the stands howling for more, a primal hunger for the unknown. Sometimes the cruelty came dressed in the revered garb of legend. Prisoners were forced to embody doomed heroes from ancient tales. Orpheus, the legendary musician, was torn apart by wild beasts. Prometheus, bound to a rock, watched as vultures circled ominously overhead. These were no longer mere stories. They were blood-soaked performances, and the unforgiving sand was their stage. Death in Rome was not always just death. Sometimes it was theater, a bloody, mocking theater. For the condemned, simply perishing was not enough. They had to perform their demise, acting out Rome's cherished myths with their own bodies.
Executions became grotesque plays where flesh replaced masks, and the script, without exception, always culminated in agony. The cruelty stretched far beyond the confines of wild beasts. Crucifixion, a brutal practice borrowed from the East, was staged directly inside the arena. Men and women were nailed to rough timbers, their suffering starkly visible, while vendors casually hawked wine and children played innocently nearby. Fire, too, joined the spectacle. Prisoners were forced into the tunica molesta, a shirt soaked in pitch, then horrifyingly set ablaze. Human torches writhed in agony as thick smoke curled into the sky. As the early Christian writer Tertullian bitterly observed, they were living torches. These killings were not merely morbid entertainment, they were potent propaganda, chilling warnings carved into living flesh. Defy Rome, and you would die slowly, agonizingly, with tens of thousands of eyes fixed upon your final moments. Not everyone, however, could stomach such sights. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, complained that these midday executions hardened the soul, stripping away empathy rather than purifying it. Violence, he warned, seeped insidiously past the arena walls, poisoning daily life.
but his eloquent protests were drowned out by the thunderous roar of a crowd that came not for justice, but for the thrill of punishment. Rome's imagination, however, did not cease with mere sand and swords. Sometimes, emperors demanded oceans inside the very heart of the city. Mock naval battles, known as naumachia, were spectacles on an insane, unimaginable scale, where water itself became a weapon. Julius Caesar established this audacious precedent in 46 BC, digging an enormous basin near the Tiber, filling it with water and real ships. Thousands of doomed captives were shoved aboard and ordered to fight as rival fleets. They were not actors, they were men condemned to die for applause. Arrows, catapults, and steel turned the basin into a floating slaughterhouse. Augustus, ever one to expand upon his predecessor's grandeur, pushed the madness further. In 2 BC, he created a basin almost 2,000 by 1,200 Roman feet, fed by a custom-built aqueduct, the Aqua Alsiatina, solely to keep it full. 30 warships clashed there, each crammed with prisoners, fated never to leave alive. The message was unmistakable. Rome could command seas where none existed. Even nature itself bent to imperial whim. By 52 AD, Claudius went further still, draining Lake Fucine to stage yet another naumachia. When the captives greeted him with the chilling salute, Ave Imperator, morituri te salutant. Hail, Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. History gained one of its most haunting, poignant lines. Whether rehearsed or born of sheer desperation, it perfectly encapsulated the utter hopelessness of men reduced to mere props. Fire, too, had its macabre myths reenacted.
Victims, still wearing their pitch-soaked tunics, were cast as heroes meeting fiery fates. Hercules consumed by poison, or Mucius Stavola testing his loyalty by holding his hand to the flames. The crowd roared with laughter as these heroes screamed, their bravery reduced to ash, their stories grotesquely twisted into mockery. Even the Colosseum's ingenious architecture fed Rome's voracious appetite for domination. Under Titus and later Domitian, engineers constructed intricate channels beneath the arena floor, allowing the sand to flood for smaller naval shows, then drain completely for gladiatorial combat the very next day. Cruelty was meticulously transformed into an engineering project. Water, fire, human flesh, everything was a mere prop in Rome's grandiose theater of control. To drown captives, to turn living bodies into human torches, to bend sacred myths into orchestrated slaughter, that was true power. The emperors were not content merely ruling men. They posed as rulers of the very elements themselves. By the late 1st century, executions were no longer mere punishments. They had evolved into elaborate scripts, dripping with creative malice, twisting cherished cultural legends into tools of profound humiliation. Take, for instance, the games inaugurating the Colosseum in 80 AD. The poet Martial recorded an actor cast as Orpheus, the divine musician said to tame wild beasts with his enchanting song. In myth, animals sat spellbound by his lyre. In the arena, a bear was deliberately released mid-performance and mauled the singer to a brutal death. Art was twisted into parody, beauty into butchery. Another victim was forced to play Daedalus, the ingenious inventor who famously escaped Crete on wings of wax and feathers. Suspended on a crude contraption meant to mimic flight, he soared briefly before plunging to the ravenous beasts below. Martial quipped, "The man must have wished for real feathers," a poet's cynical jest hiding a man's abject terror. Perhaps the most grotesque of all was the myth of Pasiphae, cursed to desire a bull. One show staged her infamous union with a mechanical beast, followed by a killing that blurred the lines between execution, humiliation, and outright pornography. A warning about hubris was transformed into public degradation. The message was chillingly clear.
Rome owned its myths just as it utterly owned its people. Heroes, villains, kings, queens, none were safe from being rewritten and recast as mere props in a pageant of death. For spectators, these scenes were often just sideshows, grim amusements between the more serious contests. For the condemned, however, they were agonizing ends, grotesquely dressed in costumes. For Rome itself, they were propaganda made flesh, proving the state could even rewrite the sacred meaning of its own legends. In the Colosseum, stories were not told with ink or marble.
They were branded into skin, burned into bone, and applauded until a suffocating silence swallowed the blood-soaked sand. The blurred line between sovereign rule and raw, unhinged obsession ultimately determined who lived, who died, and in what manner, all at an emperor's whim. Caligula, infamous for his savage moods and unpredictable rages, once ran out of animals mid-show. Without a moment's hesitation, he casually ordered spectators to be dragged from the stands to fill the gruesome gap. They had come to witness bloodshed only to become a part of it, their screams dissolving into the roar of the crowd. Nero, utterly addicted to his own theatrical image, treated the arena as his personal stage. Prisoners were dressed as tragic heroes from ancient plays, then executed in ways that chillingly mirrored their scripted fates. Nero, in his delusion, called it art. Rome, in hushed whispers, called it madness. And then came Commodus, the ultimate showman emperor. Cloaked as the mighty Hercules, he stormed into the Colosseum wielding a club and a bow, slaughtering hundreds of animals that had been deliberately crippled beforehand to guarantee his applause. He even bled the imperial treasury dry to fund his elaborate performances, forcing cheers from a terrified crowd. Not satisfied with merely vanquishing beasts, he also faced gladiators, but only with every conceivable advantage rigged in his favor. Losing was an absolute impossibility. Clapping for the fearful spectators was compulsory. Domitian, a master of paranoia, wielded the arena like a sharp weapon. He staged chilling midnight hunts by torchlight, specifically designed to keep Rome uneasy, perpetually unsure when amusement might suddenly morph into terror. Even emperors remembered as good were not immune to the pull of the spectacle. Trajan, revered as just and capable, marked his military victories with 103 days of games. Thousands of deaths were folded into a grand celebration of power. Spectacle fed the egos of rulers, but it carried a steep price. Caligula and Commodus both died violently, remembered by history not for their statecraft, but for the blood-soaked theater they commanded. The very arena that elevated them also brutally exposed their profound madness. Not every Roman, however, cheered. Philosophers, poets, and early Christians left a quieter, more somber record, one that saw undeniable rot beneath the gleaming marble. Seneca confessed that the midday executions hardened him, stripping away empathy rather than purifying the soul. Violence, he warned, seeped insidiously past the arena walls, poisoning daily life beyond its confines. Cicero, decades before, had praised bravery, yet condemned cruelty for cruelty's sake. Though even he admitted that the mob demanded games as proof of a leader's generosity. To govern, it seemed, meant constantly feeding the beast.
For early Christians, the amphitheater served as both a site of brutal persecution and, ironically, a testament to their unwavering faith. Those who steadfastly refused to renounce their beliefs were thrown to lions or burned alive, their agonizing deaths twisted into mass entertainment. Tertullian, another early Christian writer, bitterly called the shows seeds of cruelty, indicting an entire empire that cheered injustice as if it were a sport. Economically, the games devoured colossal fortunes. By the late empire, rulers frequently bankrupted themselves, desperately chasing spectacles grand enough to outshine their predecessors. What once flaunted Rome's strength became an act of sheer desperation.
Culturally, this insatiable appetite dulled Rome's intellectual and moral edge. Citizens who once honored discipline, duty, and civic virtue now merely demanded cheap bread and endless circuses. Juvenal, the satirical poet, famously mocked this hunger with the phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses. To him, this craving for spectacle betrayed just how far Rome had drifted from its austere republican roots. As the empire's vast frontiers began to crack and its funds inexorably dried up, the once mighty arenas slowly crumbled. By the 5th century, the Colosseum, still colossal and imposing, stood hollow. Its sands were silent, its deafening roars long gone, replaced only by the wind. But the profound moral questions it raised never faded. Could a society that systematically trained its people to revel in suffering truly endure? History's grim verdict, etched into its ruins, suggests otherwise. Today, the Colosseum looms, scarred yet undeniably proud. Walk its echoing tunnels, and you might still hear faint echoes. The sharp clang of iron, the primal roar of beasts, 50,000 voices rising as one, hungry for blood. The ancient stone is easy to admire, a marvel of engineering and endurance. But harder and far more honest is to remember its chilling purpose. It was a place where cruelty was rehearsed, practiced, and glorified until it felt utterly normal, an accepted part of life. Rome's arenas were not merely about blood, about the thrill of the kill. They were about control, a pervasive, insidious control that shaped how citizens thought, how they laughed, and how they ultimately obeyed. Every animal hunt, every public execution, every ancient myth grotesquely reborn in screams served the exact same singular end: to make imperial power look eternal, invincible, and utterly undeniable. And that, perhaps, is the most profound warning carved into these magnificent ruins. A civilization that glorifies violence, that consistently turns suffering into spectacle, eventually crumbles beneath the weight of its own thunderous applause. So, tell us, which of these spectacles, the brutal hunts, the horrifying living torches, or the emperors drunk on their own shows, best reveals Rome's darkest, most primal soul? Drop your thoughts below.
If this deep dive into Rome's brutal entertainments has truly gripped you, hit subscribe so you won't miss our next journey into history's most profound shadows. Until then, remember, the Colosseum may be quiet now, its grandstands empty, its sand long dry, but its chilling echoes of systematic cruelty still breathe, subtly, persistently, through its ancient stones. The stories it holds are not mere tales from a forgotten age. They are cautionary whispers, reverberating across millennia. The enduring legacy of the Colosseum isn't just about the architecture, astounding as it is. It's about understanding the human capacity for organized cruelty, for turning a blind eye to suffering when it's cloaked in entertainment. It stands as a monument to a civilization that, for centuries, normalized the unthinkable. The gladiators, the condemned, the sacrificed beasts, they were all threads in a vast, intricate tapestry woven with fear, power, and spectacle. Beyond the blood and the roar, Rome taught the world a terrifying lesson: how quickly the line between civic duty and sadistic pleasure can blur. The very foundations of society were subtly undermined by the constant demand for more gruesome, more elaborate displays. What began as a solemn ritual meant to honor the dead mutated into a ravenous monster that consumed lives for sport and political gain. This transformation from sacred obligation to state-sponsored cruelty reveals a chilling truth about power. When unchecked, when constantly reinforced by public adulation, it can twist moral compasses and justify unspeakable acts.
The emperors, from Caesar to Commodus, understood that controlling the narrative of death was a potent tool for controlling the living. Each life taken, each body broken, was a testament to their absolute authority. The irony, of course, is that the same spectacle that solidified their power ultimately contributed to their downfall. The economic drain, the moral decay, the growing dissatisfaction of those who saw through the charade, these were slow poisons, weakening the empire from within. While citizens clamored for bread and circuses, the true dangers to Rome brewed on its borders and within its own corrupted heart. Think of the Naumachie, the naval battles on artificial lakes. These weren't just about sinking ships. They were about demonstrating Rome's triumph over nature itself, its ability to reshape landscapes and command elements. It was a projection of imperial might, grand and terrifying, a godlike assertion of dominion over all creation, including human life. And the victims, forced to act out myths? This was a profound act of cultural appropriation and degradation. By twisting beloved legends, by forcing individuals to suffer the fates of heroes and villains, Rome asserted not just physical control, but ideological control. It owned the very stories that defined its people, remaking them into tools of terror.
It stripped meaning from sacrifice, replacing it with mockery. The whispers of Seneca, the laments of Christian martyrs, these were the small, dissenting voices in a roaring crowd. They remind us that even in the darkest periods, there are always those who see the moral cost, who refuse to participate in the collective delusion. Their words, preserved through history, offer a counter-narrative, a testament to the enduring human struggle against cruelty and dehumanization. The Colosseum stands today, a magnificent ruin, open to tourists who marvel at its scale. But to truly understand it, we must peel back the layers of romanticized history and confront the stark reality of its purpose. It was a place where pain was art, where terror was entertainment, and where human life was expendable in the pursuit of power and spectacle. Its hollow arches and silent stones do not merely whisper of past glories, they echo a profound warning. They tell us that societies, even the most powerful, are fragile, that the pursuit of unchecked entertainment, divorced from empathy and moral considerations, can lead to a spiritual emptiness that no amount of grand spectacle can fill. Ultimately, the lesson of Rome's arena is not about the strength of its walls, but the weakness of its soul. It's a stark reminder that true strength lies not in the ability to inflict suffering, but in the capacity for compassion, justice, and the respect for every life. The stones remember, and in their silence, they speak volumes.